In 1977, the Soviet Union was arming Somalia. By 1978, they were fighting against it. They sent Cuban soldiers, Soviet generals, and $1 billion in weapons to Somalia's enemy. The Cold War operated by a simple rule. Superpowers picked sides and stuck with them. But in the Horn of Africa, something unprecedented happened. Moscow switched allegiances mid-war, abandoning a dictator they'd armed for years and backing his sworn enemy instead. This is the story of the Ogaden War, the moment Cold War certainties collapsed and both superpowers discovered that even ideology had limits. The consequences would prove catastrophic. Multiple ambassadors would sicken. The government's response would be shaped by institutional silence and political calculation. For 2 decades, the beam would continue uninterrupted. No warnings would be issued. No protection would be offered. The machinery of secrecy would grind on, compartmentalizing knowledge, burying evidence, protecting institutional reputation above human health. This is the story of how an invisible weapon targeted American diplomats, and how the system designed to protect them chose instead to conceal the threat. Mohammed Siad Barre seized power in Somalia in 1969 with a gun and a promise. He called himself a socialist, but his real ideology was survival. Barre weaponized Marxism to consolidate control, crushing opponents, and reshaping his nation into a Soviet client state. He dressed his military strongman tendencies in revolutionary rhetoric, knowing Moscow would reward ideological compliance with weapons and prestige. Barre understood the Cold War's fundamental transaction: adopt socialism, suppress dissent, and the Soviet Union would supply your army. Moscow saw Somalia as opportunity, a strategic foothold on the Horn of Africa, control over the Indian Ocean approaches, influence over the Suez Corridor, and proximity to Middle Eastern oil routes. They poured weapons into Mogadishu without hesitation. Between 1969 and 1977, the Soviet Union poured approximately $400 million in military aid into Somalia, creating one of Africa's best-equipped armies for its size. They supplied modern T-54 and T-55 main battle tanks, advanced MiG-21 fighter jets, naval destroyers, and submarines that could project Soviet power across the Indian Ocean. Soviet military advisors, numbering in the thousands, trained Somali officers, pilots, and soldiers in Soviet doctrine and tactics. The Soviets established major naval facilities at Barre on the Red Sea, giving Moscow permanent access to one of the world's most strategically critical shipping lanes. Soviet presence transformed Somalia into a military outpost of the Soviet sphere. Across the border lay Ethiopia, ruled for decades by Emperor Haile Selassie, a figure who represented ancient African monarchy and fervent anti-communism. The U.S. saw him as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, a Christian monarchy in an increasingly contested region. Washington lavished weapons and military aid on Addis Ababa, confident in Selassie's reliability and conservative orientation. Selassie embodied stability, order, and the traditional power structure that America believed would endure. America's entire African Cold War strategy rested on him remaining in power and remaining aligned with the West. Policymakers in Washington viewed Ethiopia as permanently secure. They would soon be catastrophically wrong. By 1977, the Cold War's calculus had shattered completely. Both Somalia and Ethiopia were ruled by Marxist military strongmen who'd seized power through coups. Both countries claimed allegiance to communism and revolutionary ideology. Both desperately wanted Soviet military support to advance their regional power. But they shared a border, contested territory, and centuries of ethnic and pastoral antagonism. The Ogaden, a vast arid region in eastern Ethiopia inhabited primarily by ethnic Somali pastoralists, became the flashpoint for Cold War competition. Siad Barre coveted the Ogaden as Somali ethnic homeland. Mengistu controlled it as Ethiopian territory. Two ideological brothers, supposedly united by communism, prepared to wage war against each other. Siad Barre made a calculated decision to settle the territorial dispute through military force. He believed Moscow would support him militarily. They always had before. He'd been their reliable ally for 8 years. He was their chosen strongman in the Horn. In July 1977, he launched Operation Torch, with Western Somali Liberation Front guerrillas allied to his cause. Somali regular army troops poured into the Ogaden with their Soviet tanks and weapons. The invasion moved swiftly across the desert terrain. Barre was supremely confident. He'd carefully calculated Moscow's response and expected immediate Soviet backing. He was catastrophically wrong about Soviet priorities. Inside the Kremlin, Soviet leaders faced an impossible dilemma that forced them to choose which communist ally to back. Somalia had only 4 million people, unstable borders, and a dictator who'd already proven he could survive without Soviet support. Ethiopia had 35 million people, a vast population, ancient Christian traditions, enormous territorial expanse, and unmatched strategic value in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia was objectively bigger and more important geopolitically. Mengistu was less stable than Barre, meaning he desperately needed Soviet support to consolidate power and maintain control. Barre had other options and regional support. Soviet planners calculated coldly in terms of territory, population, Red Sea access, and geopolitical weight. Ethiopia won on every strategic measure. In May 1977, Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam traveled personally to Moscow for secret negotiations. He met directly with Soviet leadership and made his case to the Kremlin's highest levels. Ethiopia would become a loyal Soviet ally, more reliable than Somalia. He would industrialize the nation completely along communist lines, following Soviet development models. He would crush all internal dissent with revolutionary terror. He would cement Soviet influence throughout the entire Horn of Africa region. The Soviets listened intently. They were impressed by Mengistu's radicalism, his willingness to use totalitarian methods, his ideological commitment. By the end of his Moscow visit, the decision crystallized. Moscow would abandon Somalia and embrace Ethiopia as its primary African client state. In July 1977, as Somali forces advanced into the Ogaden, the Kremlin issued its formal demand. Somalia must cease the invasion immediately and withdraw. Siad Barre refused, still convinced Soviet military aid would arrive to support his position. The Kremlin issued the ultimatum again, this time with explicit consequences. Stop the invasion now, or lose all Soviet support entirely. Barre still refused, incredulous that his longtime patron had become his adversary. He couldn't comprehend that strategic calculation had overridden ideological solidarity. On November 13, 1977, Soviet transport aircraft began landing in Addis Ababa. The massive airlift had begun. Approximately 1,000 tons of weapons flowed to Ethiopia daily. What followed was the largest military airlift operation in history, since the Berlin blockade of 1948 to 1949. Soviet Antonov transport planes descended on Addis Ababa in relentless waves. They carried main battle tanks, field artillery systems, small arms ammunition, food supplies, fuel reserves, medical equipment. Within just 8 weeks, the accumulated inventory staggered observers. Approximately 1,300 T-55 and T-62 Soviet tanks, 2,000 armored personnel carriers and transport vehicles, over 6,000 tons of ammunition and explosives. Nearly $1 billion in advanced weaponry materialized in a developing nation. 1,500 Soviet military advisors and officers arrived to command operations. They established command centers, intensive training programs, strategic planning facilities, and coordinated directly with Ethiopian forces preparing for the counteroffensive. Then came the Cubans. 12,000 combat troops boarded Soviet and Cuban transport ships in Havana. Castro sent his military's finest, mechanized infantry battalions, experienced tank commanders, specialized artillery officers. They sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and around the African continent, enduring a month-long voyage, arriving in Ethiopia in December 1977. They were hardened combat veterans, battle-tested from the Angolan Civil War, ideologically committed revolutionaries trained in Soviet doctrine. They came to Ethiopia explicitly to win a war against a former Soviet ally. Siad Barre watched in deepening horror as the Cuban troops disembarked in Addis Ababa. His former Soviet patrons had become soldiers fighting directly against him, using weapons he'd been trained to use. In Washington, the dramatic Soviet shift was watched with studied astonishment and strategic calculation. The Soviet Union had just abandoned a long-term client state mid-conflict. Siad Barre was suddenly isolated, militarily desperate, and actively seeking new allies to replace lost Soviet support. The Carter administration saw a historic opening. For years, American military bases in Somalia had been blocked and excluded by Soviet dominance. Now, Barre desperately needed the United States more than the United States needed him. The Cold War strategic calculus inverted completely. The side that lost Moscow could gain Washington if it moved quickly. By December 1977, American military liaison officers arrived quietly in Mogadishu to begin preliminary negotiations. On November 13, 1977, Siad Barre made his historic final decision. He would not passively accept Soviet betrayal or wait to be abandoned. He ordered the expulsion of all Soviet advisors and military personnel from Somalia. 1,500 Soviet officers, pilots, technicians, and soldiers received immediate expulsion orders. Leave the country within days. Soviet military pilots were ordered to abandon Somali airfields. Soviet ships were instructed to depart Somali ports and naval facilities. Barre formally severed diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union and dramatically announced a new strategic alliance with the United States instead. It was a complete reversal of 8 years of Soviet alignment, executed with defiant speed. American military aid began flowing into Somalia. Not at Soviet scale. The United States never fully committed to Somalia the way Moscow had committed to Ethiopia, but enough to keep Siad Barre's weakened army operational. American Special Forces advisors arrived to train and reorganize Somali troops with American tactics. The U.S. Navy expanded its operational presence throughout the Indian Ocean, utilizing Somali ports and facilities. American intelligence officers established covert operations centers in Mogadishu. For Somalia, American support wasn't equivalent to Soviet support in scale or intensity, but it represented alliance, international recognition, and national survival. Somalia had switched superpowers and lived to fight another day. In late 1977, Soviet General Vasily Petrov arrived in Addis Ababa to take supreme command. He was a hardened commander with extensive military experience from Soviet operations in Eastern Europe and recent campaigns in Afghanistan. Petrov was given absolute command of all military operations in Ethiopia, answerable only to Moscow. He began restructuring the entire Ethiopian army immediately, along Soviet organizational lines. Soviet military units began to coalesce into coordinated divisions. The Cuban combat forces integrated with Ethiopian units under unified command. Petrov established a massive logistical network to supply the expanding army. He prepared not merely to defend Ethiopia from invasion, but to drive Somalia out entirely and consolidate Ethiopian control of contested territories. In January 1978, Somali forces had captured increasingly large swaths of the Ogaden Desert region. The critical city of Harar seemed threatened. Key supply routes and logistics centers fell under Somali control or direct attack threat. The Somali military felt momentum building, believing victory was within reach. Their weapons remained modern Soviet-supplied T-55 tanks and artillery that Barre's officers knew how to operate expertly. Barre genuinely believed his forces might actually hold and consolidate territorial gains. But General Petrov had completely different plans. He'd been systematically consolidating Ethiopian strength throughout the autumn. He'd carefully integrated Cuban forces into coordinated units. He'd meticulously mapped every road, every defensive position, every supply line in the region. On January 1978, Soviet General Petrov launched a massive counteroffensive with Soviet-commanded Ethiopian forces. Cuban tank battalions formed the offensive spearhead, equipped with advanced T-55 main battle tanks, overwhelming concentrated firepower, and battle-experienced Cuban officers who'd fought successfully in Angola. Somali forces scrambled desperately to organize a coherent defense. The battle for the critical city of Harar became the turning point of the entire campaign. Cuban armor crashed through Somali defensive lines with superior tank tactics. Soviet military advisors coordinated devastating artillery barrages against Somali positions. Ethiopian troops, newly trained in Soviet doctrine and heavily armed with modern equipment, advanced relentlessly against weakening Somali resistance. Somali forces retreated from Harar. Throughout January and February 1978, Somali forces conducted continuous strategic retreat. They'd fought competently, using Soviet tactics they'd mastered, but they couldn't match the overwhelming concentration of firepower arrayed systematically against them. Soviet generals commanded coordinated Ethiopian operations. Cuban soldiers died fighting Somali troops they'd trained alongside years before. Advanced Soviet T-55 tanks fought each other across desert terrain. The battles raged continuously across the Ogaden region. The strategic town of Jijiga fell. Then critical supply lines collapsed. Then military morale shattered. Siad Barre's defeated army pulled back across the border into Somalia. The war had lasted approximately 6 months, from initial invasion to complete retreat. Somalia had lost decisively. Massive displacement followed the military fighting as Ethiopian forces advanced. Hundreds of thousands of Somali civilians, pastoral families, merchants, urban populations, fled the Ogaden region in desperation. They fled westward toward Somalia, toward overcrowded refugee camps, toward prolonged exile. International aid organizations arrived urgently to manage the humanitarian crisis. The United Nations estimated nearly 700,000 refugees were forcibly displaced from Ethiopian territory during the conflict. Refugee camps in Somalia became severely overcrowded beyond capacity. Disease epidemics spread through displaced populations. The humanitarian cost of the Cold War superpower switch was measured directly in displaced lives and refugee suffering. The Ogaden region fell completely under Ethiopian military control. With the Ogaden War decisively won, Colonel Mengistu moved swiftly to consolidate absolute personal authority over Ethiopia. He purged political rivals from the Derg Revolutionary Council. He systematically eliminated anyone who might challenge his emerging dictatorship. Soviet military advisors watched carefully as he reshaped Ethiopia into a totalitarian police state. The scale of political repression was staggering historically. Tens of thousands executed, entire regions pacified through state terror, families liquidated for ideological opposition. The Red Terror campaign killed an estimated 100,000 to 200,000 people. Mengistu had won the Ogaden War militarily. Now he was consolidating absolute power domestically. Moscow had won the Ogaden War decisively, but inherited enormous ongoing costs. Ethiopian military and economic dependence became permanent. And permanent. The Kremlin had to continually supply advanced weapons, maintain military advisors, provide technical training and support for years. The Soviet economy couldn't sustain indefinite military commitments in Africa while managing Eastern European security. Ethiopia was vastly larger and significantly poorer than Somalia had been. The military victory, strategically significant for controlling the Horn, became economically exhausting for the Soviet budget. Soviet economic planners began realizing quietly they'd traded a smaller strategic liability for a much larger economic burden. For Somalia, the aftermath was catastrophic and irreversible. The military defeat had damaged the army comprehensively. The war loss destroyed national morale and confidence. Siad Barre's political authority, though formally intact, was profoundly diminished. He'd publicly promised military victory and delivered military defeat. He'd staked everything on Soviet support and had lost it completely. The nation began splintering politically. Ethnic tensions long suppressed by his military dictatorship began erupting violently. Clan politics intensified across regions. Somalia didn't collapse into state failure immediately in 1978, but the Ogaden War set in inexorable motion forces that would systematically destroy the Somali state over the next 13 years. Having won the Ogaden War, Mengistu immediately faced different military enemies. Guerrilla forces in Eritrea seeking independence, armed rebels in other regions resisting his totalitarian control. The Tigray People's Liberation Front mounted increasingly sophisticated military operations against the regime. Soviet weapons could suppress these insurgencies temporarily, but not eliminate them permanently. Ethiopia became systematically trapped in endless internal conflicts, consuming resources. Soviet advisors and weapons systems poured in continuously for 3 decades without end. The Kremlin's victory in 1978 paradoxically launched Ethiopia into a succession of internal wars spanning the next 13 years. Across the entire Cold War world, the Ogaden War's implications registered immediately. Ideology was fundamentally negotiable. Client-state allegiance wasn't permanent or irreversible. Superpower commitments shifted rapidly, with strategic calculation and geopolitical interest. In Africa, nations began systematically reassessing their Cold War alignments and alliance obligations. In Moscow and Washington, strategic planners recognized definitively that ideology alone couldn't bind allies permanently. The Ogaden War proved that Cold War certainties, the seemingly immutable idea that Soviet allies remained Soviet, American allies remained American, were elaborate illusions. Siad Barre committed entirely to American support, though American military aid was never at Soviet Cold War scale. American military bases expanded substantially in Mogadishu and coastal regions. Strategic access to Indian Ocean shipping lanes became the critical foundation of the U.S.-Somalia relationship. The U.S. Navy used Somalia as a strategic base for counterbalancing Soviet naval presence in East Africa. But American support remained transactional, not transformative. American aid couldn't rebuild Somalia's defeated army comprehensively, or stabilize its fragmenting politics. The Ogaden War became the Cold War's most dramatic and unprecedented reversal. 2 superpowers switched client states simultaneously mid-conflict. Advanced Soviet weapons fought advanced Soviet weapons. Cuban soldiers fought against soldiers they'd previously trained in allied nations. The communist ideology that supposedly united Soviet and Cuban revolutionaries proved weaker than strategic geopolitical interest. The Cold War's apparent ideological stability shattered dramatically in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia won the military war, but remained indefinitely militarily dependent on Soviet support. Somalia lost everything: its superpower patron, military equipment, regional prestige. By 1991, the Somali state collapsed entirely into chaos. Siad Barre's regime fell in complete military and political defeat. No stable government replaced it. Regional clan militias filled the power vacuum violently. American military intervention in 1993 attempted to stabilize the nation, but ultimately failed comprehensively. For Somalia, the Ogaden War had represented the beginning of the end state collapse. The military defeat wounded the state mortally. The authoritarian dictatorship that followed couldn't rebuild institutional capacity. The nation fragmented into competing warlordism, maritime piracy, and persistent regional instability for decades. Ethiopia remained locked in Soviet military and economic embrace for 15 consecutive years. The Kremlin continuously pumped advanced weapons systems into endless internal insurgencies. Soviet military advisors stayed in place throughout. Mengistu remained in absolute power, systematically propped up by Moscow's continuous support. When the Cold War ended abruptly and Soviet support evaporated completely in 1991, Ethiopia's fragile economy collapsed immediately. Mengistu was overthrown militarily in 1991, fleeing into exile in Zimbabwe. Ethiopia entered a new political era, but decades of Soviet-subsidized military conflict had devastated economic development and infrastructure. The Ogaden War reveals Soviet foreign policy operating on multiple levels. Officially, Soviet leaders claimed they backed Ethiopia for ideological reasons. Mengistu's radical Marxism justified abandoning Somalia. But Soviet planners were equally influenced by strategic calculation. Ethiopia's larger population, geography, and Red Sea access made it more valuable. Soviet decision-making involved both ideology and strategy, often contradicting each other. These consequences would ripple forward through subsequent decades. The understanding of this crisis evolved only gradually. The full scope remained hidden from public view. The details accumulated slowly over time. The Ogaden War reveals Soviet foreign policy operating on multiple levels. Officially, Soviet leaders claimed they backed Ethiopia for ideological reasons. Mengistu's radical Marxism justified abandoning Somalia. But Soviet planners were equally influenced by strategic calculation. Ethiopia's larger population, geography, and Red Sea access made it more valuable. Soviet decision-making involved both ideology and strategy, often contradicting each other. These consequences would ripple forward through subsequent decades. The understanding of this crisis evolved only gradually. The full scope remained hidden from public view. The details accumulated slowly over time. Cuban deployment in Ethiopia established a model the Soviet Union replicated in other conflicts. By using Cuban troops rather than Soviet troops, the Kremlin intervened decisively while maintaining technical distance from combat. This approach avoided direct Soviet-American confrontation, allowed claims of advisory status, and provided Cuba with prestige as a revolutionary actor. For the Soviet Union, the Cuban proxy model proved cost-effective. The understanding of this crisis evolved only gradually. The full scope remained hidden from public view. The details accumulated slowly over time. 47 years after the Ogaden War, substantial documentation remains classified in Soviet, American, Cuban, and Ethiopian archives. Declassified materials reveal Soviet calculations and American responses, but questions persist. Which Soviet leaders argued for Ethiopia over Somalia? Did Castro initiate Cuban deployment or obey Moscow? What domestic calculations influenced the Derg? The record provides outline, but not every detail. These consequences would ripple forward through subsequent decades. The understanding of this crisis evolved only gradually. The full scope remained hidden from public view. The details accumulated slowly over time. The Ogaden War challenged assumptions about Cold War rigidity. Traditional analysis portrayed the Cold War as locked into stable blocks. Yet, in 1977 to 1978, superpowers reorganized entire regions. Soviet backing shifted mid-conflict. American barriers to accepting former Soviet clients proved negotiable. The war reveals Cold War alliances operated on strategic calculation rather than ideology. The historical significance of this event cannot be overstated. These consequences would ripple forward through subsequent decades. The understanding of this crisis evolved only gradually. The full scope remained hidden from public view. The details accumulated slowly over time. Intelligence agencies protect classified sources and methods from Cold War operations. Historians work with partial access to complete a clearer picture of superpower decisions. The Ogaden War shows that decades after the Cold War's end, deepest decisions remain partially hidden. The record evolves as new documents emerge. The historical significance of this event cannot be overstated. These consequences would ripple forward through subsequent decades. The understanding of this crisis evolved only gradually. The full scope remained hidden from public view. The details accumulated slowly over time. The Ogaden War's consequences extended through subsequent decades. The conflict created deep animosity between Somalia and Ethiopia. The war empowered Mengistu, who initiated famines and Eritrean conflicts. Somalia's defeat catalyzed state collapse. The territorial dispute remained unresolved. From 2024, the Ogaden War traces to multiple regional catastrophes spanning 46 years. The historical significance of this event cannot be overstated. These consequences would ripple forward through subsequent decades. The understanding of this crisis evolved only gradually. The full scope remained hidden from public view. The details accumulated slowly over time. Ogaden War showed that Cold War rigidity was an illusion. Ideology bent to strategy. Client states were temporary. Superpower commitments were contingent. Yet the lesson was forgotten. The Cold War's final decade saw renewed attempts to define stable spheres. The lesson that allies could switch sides didn't prevent future miscalculations. The historical significance of this event cannot be overstated. These consequences would ripple forward through subsequent decades. The understanding of this crisis evolved only gradually. The full scope remained hidden from public view. The details accumulated slowly over time. The Ogaden War's unprecedented nature derives from timing. Cold War shifts occurred during coups, negotiations, or between conflicts. The Ogaden War was unique. The Soviet Union switched sides mid-conflict. In May 1977, Soviets allied with Somalia. By January 1978, Soviet generals commanded Ethiopian forces fighting Somali soldiers with Soviet weapons. This mid-conflict reversal required massive airlift, rapid retraining, and Cuban deployment. The understanding of this crisis evolved only gradually. The full scope remained hidden from public view. The details accumulated slowly over time. In archives across Moscow, Washington, Addis Ababa, and Mogadishu, classified documents remain sealed. Critical decisions made in secret meeting rooms, intelligence reports filed away, military planning locked in vaults. The complete story of Moscow's choice, American back channels to Barre, Soviet-Cuban conversations, much remains unknown. Historians pieced fragments together, but the deepest decision-making remains partly classified. Perhaps one day those documents surface. Until then, the war's deepest secrets stay buried. The full scope remained hidden from public view. The details accumulated slowly over time.